Government motions. The Honourable Minister for the Environment, Energy, Climate Change and Education.
Mr. Speaker, I have the honour to move the motion standing in my name, which reads as follows. This House acknowledges the excellent work that the employees of Master Service Gibraltar Limited have done and do in discharging their obligations to keep Gibraltar clean. Notes and acknowledges the recent complaints by the public generally and by the government specifically, the latter made directly to the directors of Master Service, of the state of cleanliness of parts of Gibraltar, which is not satisfactory and which does not, in the government's view, arise from any inaction on the part of the employees of Master Service. Considers that such an unsatisfactory state of cleanliness is neither in the interests of residents nor of visitors to Gibraltar. Further notes the end of the period of the contract between the government and Master Service, which contract was awarded by the former GSD administration without any competitive tender process having been followed. Further acknowledges and welcomes a decision of the government to comply with European and national legislation in going out to tender for a new contract for municipal cleaning services, which will be designed to transparently ensure that Gibraltar is provided with better value for money to the taxpayer, a consistent high standard of cleanliness throughout Gibraltar, and additionally, that will provide stability to the employees of Master Service Limited. Mr. Speaker, I feel that I am particularly qualified to table this motion. I have been known in some circles as El Jardinero, and my duties as a jardinero included sweeping, collecting litter on a regular basis, emptying bins, taking this to the refuse dump again on a regular basis. So I know how hard this work can be. And also I know, Mr. Speaker, how proud one can be having carried out these tasks, which some people may consider to be menial, but are not menial at all, because of the satisfaction you get looking back on your work and seeing how an area improves and can be enjoyed by the whole of the community. So I have myself, Mr. Speaker, personally and regularly carried out a lot of the duties that the employees of Master Service carry out regularly, day in and day out. Mr. Speaker, this last summer, the issue of cleaning attracted a lot of attention. It is true, Mr. Speaker, that it is always at its worst at the end of the summer, with no rain and so on. But I am not arguing that this summer was not particularly bad. This was a concern of mine, indeed, and before it was on social media, I had already met with the directors in order to require an improvement. It should not have required my direct involvement, Mr. Speaker. Let's first of all start by considering what causes dirty streets. Mr. Speaker, rubbish doesn't get there on its own. It gets there through the agency of humans, and I cannot emphasize enough that we must all work hard to make sure that that small minority that may be irresponsible litters even less. The type of litter is the traditional litter of crisp packets and bottles and so on, dropped here and there. People putting out rubbish in the wrong place and at the wrong time, or without the correct bags. Irresponsible dog owners, perhaps, who fail to clear up. I repeat, Mr. Speaker, it is very much a minority. But sadly, as so often happens, as the workforce sees day by day, it only takes a few. Someone can work very, very hard in cleaning up an area now, and one irresponsible person can mess it up in an hour or two. But as I say, it is the minority that has this effect. We have to accept that we are not living in an ideal world and that there will be rubbish, and then the next step, of course, is cleaning. And of course, it is a government's responsibility to ensure that the rubbish that will occur, sadly but inevitably, is cleaned. Part of this responsibility was, of course, again, back in 1999, contracted out to Master Service Gibraltar Limited. And it was a type of contract, Mr. Speaker, that by its very nature, in the way that it was set out and in the way that there were insufficient controls by government worked into it, that could go very, very wrong and could end up, most literally, in a mess. Speaker, the workforce of master service work long hours in a job that, again, by experience I know, can be tedious, is not always pleasant, and often can be most unpleasant. And it takes dedication and commitment to carry it out. Most workers have to work weekends or are currently working weekends, including bank holidays. The worst time for the workforce in terms of workload are those following when we are celebrating National Day. They must all be wondering what they're going to have to clear up the next day. Absolutely normal. I know from experience when we had to clean up after functions once again in the Alameda Gardens. And of course, Christmas and New Year, when we are out there celebrating and taking time off, and the master service workforce has to be aware of the work that is coming their way. It's especially hard for road sweepers through periods of intense rain and stormy weather, when even the best waterproofs, if they had the worst waterproofs, are porous. And in these conditions, they sometimes have to be working in the cold, when they are wet under the waterproofs, and causing them to suffer from colds and throat and chest infections, which they frequently do in the winter months. This is almost a characteristic of the trade, but not something that we should take for granted, but is often forgotten. They start their working day extremely early, many workers starting the day at 6 a.m. And some of the workforce are in fact very highly trained and qualified. For example, those who work in the Upper Rock and have to carry out duties from the treetops, specialized in rope work and qualified in rope work, in health and safety, first aid, in the use of chainsaws, hedge trimmers, and forklifts and other machinery. And some of the equipment that they use, like the water pressure machines, can be very dangerous. There was an incident some time ago with a single worker operating one of these machines at 5 a.m., all by himself, had an accident and the machine blew up. Thankfully, this was at a reasonable distance and there was no serious injury. Having to deal with the recycling bins and being criticized and people saying, no, they're not doing right, and then having to wait up for 1.5 hours to drop off cardboard and other recycling items. Something that people may not appreciate is that when there is very heavy rainfall in the region and the rivers in the region burst their banks, the cleaning of the beaches becomes particularly difficult, including the possibility of animal carcasses being washed up. They've included baby whales, cattle, and even in 2003, the carcass of a donkey that had to be cut up before being taken to the incinerator by this workforce. This is hazardous work, and sometimes they don't have all the equipment that perhaps they might need. So among other things, Mr. Speaker, the workers involved clean the town area, the Upper Rock, the beaches, estates and patios, parks, carry out the maintenance of the automated toilets and other public toilets, the Upper Town area, all the roads in the South District to Europa Point. They clean bin cubicles after the rubbish has been collected, flush down the streets, do weeding in green areas, and pick up cardboard for recycling. It's all hard work, and I can say, Mr. Speaker, that once again, that I know exactly how hard it is. And Mr. Speaker, it can be heartbreaking to find your work undone. Heartbreaking too if you don't have enough equipment or are not given enough time to do it, or in your opinion, those who manage you may not be prioritizing the work in the way that you would with the experience that you have. Mr. Speaker, we all have frustrations at work, but in the case of these workers, their frustrations, through no fault of theirs, can become the next post on Speak Freely or the next tweet by an opposition MP. Mr. Speaker, this is simply not fair. Nor, Mr. Speaker, is the opposition motion by the Honourable Trevor Hammond, which is down for discussion later on, which also, in the way that it is worded, could direct those who may not be aware towards the workforce. I would hope that in the light of this motion, Mr. Speaker, that other private member's motion could be withdrawn. Making this sort of statement, criticizing the cleanliness of the streets, without qualifying it, without any explanations, in the media, social or media or in the press, can, if you don't know the details, cast aspersion on those who do the work. This was simply not good enough, and is one of the reasons precisely why the government has brought this motion to this House, to clear the name of those who may be blamed by those who aren't aware of the facts. Because, Mr. Speaker, what we cannot do is blame the workforce. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the workforce were here this morning expecting the motion to be taken there in a very peaceful demonstration of their concerns, but I must add for the public record that they did that in their own time, using the time afforded for them for the lunch breaks and so on, and did not prejudice the work which they always responsibly carry out. Mr. Speaker, a member of the workforce does what he is told. He works where he is deployed, and he delivers his work in proportion to how he is provided with the means to do this work: equipment, vehicles, protective clothing, and also to his morale. And management has the responsibility to ensure that all this is available and that the morale is kept high by ensuring that the workers are able to perform their duties to the best of their abilities, which, as we have seen, are considerable. It is management that decides, in this type of contract, how the money is divided between the different aspects of the work, and who decides what resources are put to the operational side, the administrative side, and the company and directors. It is not the workforce. It is management who must ensure that they have brooms and bags and gloves and protective clothing and equipment and vehicles so that the contractual duties can be delivered. It is management, too, who decide whether to go that little bit further in delivering what they have been contracted to deliver, a clean Gibraltar, both by supporting the staff and in response to a public outcry and to the direct involvement several times of the minister. It is not the workforce. Add to that an out-of-date contract, Mr. Speaker, awarded by the GSD in 1999 without a tender process, and then extended in 2004 on a month-to-month basis, and then in 2007 for 10 years, with some adjustment, but not reflecting the increasing needs of the community, and without the mechanism to make it dynamic and ensure that it kept up with the times. Gibraltar is more populated, more areas need attention, more estates, more commercial activity. It's the success of Gibraltar that leads inevitably to this. And it's constantly under scrutiny. There is a lot more awareness. We are more demanding and have greater expectations, and rightly so. So a contract that requires an estate to be flushed once a quarter, which means just before and just after the summer, is simply not good enough. The need also, Mr. Speaker, because of the restrictive nature of the contract, to make extra payment for extra work. While sometimes this is justified, it is not fair on the taxpayer. And again, Mr. Speaker, the worker is simply, obviously, and most certainly not responsible for this. In the face of all of this, and of the legal requirements of the process, the government decided not to simply extend, but to go out to tender. Mr. Speaker, many workers were upset. They came to see us, the Chief Minister, myself, together and separately, wanting reassurance. And they wanted reassurance on a number of things, Mr. Speaker, but on two main counts. One, that their work output was not being questioned, and I think that the motion today clearly demonstrates that. And two, on the uncertainty of what being between contracts entailed. Mr. Speaker, in order to do away with at least some of the uncertainty, I am happy to say that following Monday's cabinet meeting, the tender is now ready to go and will be published in the European Journal at the earliest opportunity. That is imminently, Mr. Speaker. And that the documents, and more importantly, the contract that will emanate from it following the process, will contain all of the guarantees that the workforce and the GGCA in representing them has been asking for. And they deserve to be reassured because, Mr. Speaker, they really are proud of their work. They were disappointed, maybe even heartbroken, to see it apparently trashed on Facebook, potentially by parliamentary motions, and to feel that people may think that it is them, hard workers and that they are, and the hard workers that they are, that are responsible. I must categorically say, Mr. Speaker, that it is not a reflection on the workforce, and that they have the full trust and confidence, mine and the government's, which is why we have said from day one that they would be fully protected in any contractual transition, and it is why I am proud to be bringing this motion today, Mr. Speaker. And because it is only fair and it is only right. Mr. Speaker, the future is bright. There will be new specifications reflecting the current and future needs of Gibraltar, new areas covered at greater frequency, and including a range of green areas which up to now have not been covered. So, Mr. Speaker, we must all look forward to a much improved, up-to-date and focused contract. A contract where all of the taxpayers' money will go towards cleaning our streets and our green areas, and not that which can be decided by the contractors. A contract that the workers, ensuring a much cleaner and pleasant Gibraltar with a vast experience and dedication, will feel fully supported and valued, with the result that they and the whole of Gibraltar will be well and truly proud of their work and of the Gibraltar that they will help to define. Mr. Speaker, I commend this motion to the House.
I now propose a question in the terms of the motion moved by the Honourable the Minister for the Environment, Energy, Climate Change and Education. The Honourable Trevor Hammond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to begin certainly by associating myself with some of the Minister's comments, which were very valid regarding the hard work done by people in the cleaning sector in Gibraltar, by the employees of master services. It is hard work, there is no denying that. The Minister mentioned that it's particularly hard work after days when others might be celebrating. That doesn't necessarily fall to the crux of the issue. It's always understood that after celebrations, whether they be National Day celebrations, whether they be the cavalcade in Main Street, extra work is generated, and certainly the whole debate that may have gone on in social media and elsewhere has been nothing to do with those special occasions, but more about the underlying concerns, which I'm pleased to say the Minister accepts in his motion regarding the general cleanliness of Gibraltar. Now, the Minister has to some extent put words into my motion, my private member's motion, which will hopefully be heard later today, regarding how that may impact or how it may be suggestive of somehow a lack of work on the behalf of the workers of master services. That couldn't be further from the truth. It is simply not the case. The motion that I put forward is purely about the cleanliness of Gibraltar, does not in any way subscribe or intend to apportion any blame in particular for the situation, but as will become clear when I make my speech to that motion, because I will not be withdrawing it, it'll be clear that no blame will be apportioned. Indeed, I work in an industry where we operate in what is known as a just culture. It's a no-blame culture in that respect. We don't work in a space where if something goes wrong, it has to be somebody's fault. Far from it. That appears to be where the Minister is coming from, which is very sad because it's a very old-fashioned view. No one is to blame necessarily for the state of our streets. We need to look at the problem and we need to find the solution. That is what a just culture is about. Not about pointing fingers at the management of master services, or the ministers indeed, and certainly not the workers of master services. It's about having a just approach to how we deal with this and a just way of moving forward on this. Now, I do have an amendment to the motion, which I hope the House will find acceptable, and I would like to read that now, if possible, Mr. Speaker.
What you do is you provide a copy for me.
Oh, has one not been provided?
Yes. You read it out, give me a copy, and then we make copies of that and circulate it.
Okay.
So please read out your
It's circulated. I believe it's been circulated. I believe it has been circulated, Mr. Speaker.
It has been?
So I will read out
Read it out.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, I propose the following amendment to the terms of the motion standing. standing in the name of the Honourable Minister for the Environment, Energy, Climate Change and Education. In paragraph 2, delete the government and replace with members of this House. Delete the latter made directly to the directors of Master Service. Delete government's view and replace with view of the members of this House. In paragraph 4, insert Gibraltar Limited after service and delete without any competitive process having been followed and replace with is imminent. In paragraph 5, insert contract after which, insert contract after which, after stability, insert the recognition of the service and insert Gibraltar Limited after service. And I do hope I read that correctly. Mr. Speaker, I table my amendment to the government motion in order to try and seek unanimity in this House for an issue that is not only vital to our community, but an issue that affects the livelihood of many workers currently employed by Master Services who have done sterling work for Gibraltar over these past 17 years. There is no question, and all seem to be in agreement, that the condition of our streets, their cleanliness, has been deteriorating over these past months. Indeed, were it not for some unseasonable rain during August, the situation could have been a lot worse than it is now. It is not easy to understand why this should have been. It is certainly not being suggested that there has been any lack of effort on the part of the employees of Master Services or even the company itself. On this, I believe we are all agreed. We're also all in agreement that the present state of affairs is unsatisfactory, as is stated in the Minister's motion, and is not in the interest of those of us resident to the Rock, both because none of us wish to live in such an environment, and it is not the impression of our beautiful and unique country which we would like visitors to take away. Indeed, in the long term, such impressions can be damaging to our economy, as such impressions are shared and spread amongst visitors, both by word of mouth and through online media. Our tourist industry has been struggling to recover since the lows of 2012. We do not wish anything to inhibit future growth. So something needs to be done. And something needs to be done urgently about the condition of our streets. On that, we all agree. Mr. Speaker, government has decided that it wishes to retender the Master Services contract. This is, of course, within its gift, and we have no difficulty in supporting this. Government says it will do this transparently, and I certainly hope that this means full transparency with full consultation with all stakeholders affected, and once a contract has been awarded, the ability to test that commitment to transparency in this House without government falling back on the usual excuses of commercial confidentiality to avoid answering difficult questions. It is, of course, the workers of Master Services who are most affected and most vulnerable during this process, and it is they who must be protected. I myself have been through a number of retendering processes in my own employment and am acutely aware of how unsettling, even unnerving it is. It introduces uncertainty no matter what assurances are provided, and where one's employment is concerned, uncertainty is never a good thing. Above all else, I ask that government keeps this at the forefront of its thinking during this process. Many of the employees of Master Services have provided many long years of dedicated service to our community. It is not an easy job, as the Minister has said, and it is a job for which we are very grateful to them for doing. Having done such a superb job over so many years, if that is now to change, it needs to be ensured that any new service provider can provide the service to the same excellent standards as has been the case with Master Services, and that the current employees of Master Services are completely protected in every aspect of their employment. Indeed, to this aim, I wonder if government would commit to reviewing the concept of nationalising the service to ensure the protection of the workforce. Mr. Speaker, it is a given that the transfer of undertakings, protection of employment regulations, commonly known as 2P, will apply to any changes in the contract provider, and therefore not only employment is protected, but all terms and conditions associated with that employment. However, those terms and conditions are not protected forever. Indeed, 2P regulations apply for a year after the transfer, and it is vital that government attain guarantees from any new service provider, should there be a new service provider, that they will not in the future, in order to improve profits or for any other reason begin to erode those conditions of employment applicable at the time of transfer. A commitment of this nature will go some way to allaying the fears of the employees of master services regarding their future. Of course, another significant factor which might affect employees in any transfer of undertaking is what any new service provider might be offering by way of a pension. And here we are not able to rely on 2P for safeguards. Here we have to rely on government ensuring that the provision of employee pensions is a part of the tender requirement, and that whatever pension is in place under any new service provider, it is at least as good as that currently available to the workforce. Mr. Speaker, we all look to the day of our retirement, and we all plan for that day, many years ahead in terms of our pensions and investments. None of us wishes to rely only on the state for our pensions, and neither does the state wish its people to rely solely on it for a pension, as providing such is not easily affordable. It is in the long-term interest of this community that employees of master services continue to be given the opportunity to invest in their futures through a pension scheme, and it is the least that can be demanded of any new service provider that it make this commitment to the workforce. Mr. Speaker, in similar vein, it is important that the contract for which government tenders is for the services as currently provided by master services. That is, the whole suite of services provided by that company, and that the government does not attempt to break this down into a series of smaller contracts. If such were attempted, it would do a disservice both to the community and to the current employees of master services. A disservice to the community because the management and oversight of several small contracts is more complex than for a single large contract. A disservice to the employees, as they will find themselves divided into penny packets across many companies and are in this way more likely to see their employment conditions deteriorate over time. The old adage of divide and rule would very much take effect to the detriment of the workers. Government must provide assurances that this will not happen, and that there will be a single tender for one service provider to take over all of the services currently provided by master services. And I say this without excluding the possibility that master services successfully bid for the tender. Mr. Speaker, I hope that the House can see that my amended motion is designed to facilitate agreement across this House. Remove the politics, if you like, from an issue over which there is a great deal of common ground, and provide a platform from which unanimity can be achieved, because I'm certain that all of us here support those basic principles set out in the motion, that in the interest of the community, our streets need to be cleaner, that the employees of master services have done and continue to do an excellent job, and that their employment must be carefully protected, and that it is important to provide transparency and value for money for our community. Mr. Speaker, I commend my amendments to the motion to the House.
I now propose a question in the terms of the amendments moved by the Honourable Trevor Hammond. And I would advise honourable members that if they wish to speak on the issues widely and not just specifically support the amendment, if they wish to speak on the issues widely, they should wait until the amendment is dealt with. These are relatively minor amendments. They can be dealt with specifically. However, if they wish to speak specifically supporting the amendment moved by the Honourable Trevor Hammond, they can do so, and they would still be able to speak generally on the issue. But they have to be careful that they don't do both. I hope the position is clear. So does any honourable member wish to speak on the Honourable Trevor Hammond's amendment? The Honourable the Chief Minister.
Mr. Speaker, the introduction that we have heard from the Honourable the Minister for the Environment has set out the position of the government in relation to the motion very, very clearly. And in doing so, Mr. Speaker, I think the Honourable Minister has dealt with a lot of what the Honourable Mr. Hammond now tries to undermine with this amendment. And so, Mr. Speaker, without speaking on the general principles of what the motion seeks to deal with, which I will deal with in the context of a later intervention, seeking to deal only with the amendment and the things that Mr. Hammond has said after he moved the amendment, I think it will be obvious to those who are listening that Mr. Hammond has realized that he has made for himself a difficult hook on which he started to hang when he moved the motion which is on the order paper under private members' motions, and which talks about the state of cleanliness of our streets, which he said in his private members' motion was not meeting the standard that the community would expect, without identifying there that he was not somehow trying to besmirch the reputation of the good men and women who work at master services and who have been doing the magnificent job that the Honourable Minister for the Environment has highlighted in the course of his introduction, and which Mr. Hammond has tried to salvage in the context of what he has said. Let's be very clear. Let us set in mind what was happening at the time that this opportunistic motion came as a private member's motion. There was comment in social media, there was comment generally about state of cleanliness. The Honourable Ms. Hassan Naon made a comment in this House that Gibraltar was smelly, she said, Mr. Speaker. And then we receive this motion that does not identify and properly exonerate the men and women of master services from those circumstances. Indeed, the Honourable Gentleman now tells us that he operates in a culture of no blame, which he appears to tell us is the sophisticated way of doing things, and blames us for not identifying that. Well, Mr. Speaker, has he ever been to a question time in this House when he is asking questions, or is he so detached from his own reality that he doesn't realise he spends most of his time in this House, seeking to blame ministers for things far beyond their political reach? But so be it, Mr. Speaker, so be it. In the same way as we have been told that we should not be making announcements until the ink is dry, we'll look forward to not being blamed for things and simply analysing during the course of question time how things could be improved without seeking to spread blame. But what we are not going to be able to do, Mr. Speaker, in the context of a parliament, is not to be political. And so when the Honourable Gentleman says that the amendments are designed to take the politics out of the motion in the Gibraltar Parliament, Mr. Speaker, look, I'm sorry to say, even the motion this morning, we were largely united in the end, was a political motion. It's one thing to be partisan. It's quite another thing to be political. Everything that happens in this place is political. This is the political heart of our democracy. It's quite another to be partisan. Now, if what the Honourable Gentleman intended to say was that he was trying to remove the partisan aspects of the motion, well then, Mr. Speaker, I would put it to him that what he is doing is actually trying to introduce a different spin on the partisan in the context of what he's trying to do. So what he's trying to do is to take out the fact from the motion, that the tender was awarded, or rather, the contract was awarded without tender. Now, Mr. Speaker, this is, by Gibraltar standards, a huge tender. When it goes as one tender, it's many millions of pounds a year. There are procurement rules, not Gibraltar rules, European rules, which have now been transposed into Gibraltar law, which require under law that contracts like this are put out to tender. Why? So that there isn't a failure of transparency in the award. Gibraltar is always rife with rumours, Mr. Speaker, that tenders are going to be awarded to this friend of a minister or that relative of a minister or this friend of an ex-minister, or was given to an ex-friend of a minister or a relative of a minister. That is par for the course in Gibraltar. Unfortunately, it's constant that one hears those rumours. Under any administration, you hear the rumours. But, Mr. Speaker, it's one thing to hear rumours. It's quite another thing to see it happen. And, Mr. Speaker, what we're not going to do is to take out the reference in this motion that rightly condemns the former administration for having given a tender, rather, given a contract out of tender, in particular given the amounts that we are dealing with, which are required by law to go to tender. European tender. So we are not going to remove that condemnation, which is a core aspect of what is wrong here. We will not remove the words without any competitive tender process having been followed, because that is part of what the problem has been, and it is right to identify that, Mr. Speaker. We are not going to agree that the complaints should be reflected to be by members of the House and not also by the government, because the government made specific complaint to the directors of the existing contractor about the state of cleanliness. It would be equally factually wrong to remove the reference to the lack of tender as it would be not to include the specific reference to the complaint from the government to the contractor's directors about their failings, not the failings of those who do the work at the sharp end, their failings as the contractor, Mr. Speaker. So, is it that the honourable gentleman thinks that he can persuade us to remove facts from a motion? But, Mr. Speaker, that is not to make the motion less political or less partisan. That is to make the motion less factual. And because unless he gets up and persuades me that every member on this side of the House and every civil servant that advised us missed the advertisement, we're not going to remove the aspect that says that it wasn't advertised and it wasn't tendered. And because we know that the minister made the complaint directly to the directors about their failures, not the failures of the men and women at the sharp end, we're not going to remove the factual reference in the motion to that complaint, Mr. Speaker. It just doesn't make any sense that he should suggest that that is the case. Now, if he had said, look, I'm prepared to withdraw my motion if this motion refers also, in addition to the reference to the government's own complaints, to the members of the House view. In addition to just the members of the government, you said, well, look, I'm going to take away my motion, a motion which doesn't exonerate the workforce. I'd be happy to see him withdraw it because it doesn't exonerate the workforce. If you include also the complaints of members of this House generally in the context of your motion, well, then we might have had an opportunity to work together. No, he doesn't want to do that. He wants to take out the reference to the government's complaints and supplant for them the complaints of all members of the House. So that is not going to be acceptable to the government, Mr. Speaker. And then he wants to add the words to provide not just stability, which is our wording, and recognition of service to the employees of Master Service Gibraltar Limited. He wants to add the word Gibraltar. That's just about the name of the company. The company already appears with its full name in the first line. I don't think there's any need to repeat that. So, Mr. Speaker, we would, in normal circumstances, accept an amendment that said, and recognition of service. But it is the height of hypocrisy for the person who has moved the motion that doesn't recognize the service of those individuals and simply complains about cleanliness to be the one to bring that amendment here. But we are reflecting that recognition, Mr. Speaker, in the context of the first line of the motion. The first line of the motion that the government is moving today, that the minister is moving today, and that I am giving the government's full support to, says, the government, the House, acknowledges the excellent work that the employees of Master Services Gibraltar Limited have done and do in discharging their obligations to keep Gibraltar clean. Now, Mr. Speaker, I think that is as clear as can be. A recognition. He just wants to add the word and recognition. But that is as clear as can be a recognition of the excellent work that the men and women of Master Services do, that there can be in any motion brought to this House in respect of any subject. But I'll tell him what I suggest, Mr. Speaker. None of his amendments enjoy the support of this side of the House for the reasons I've given. But I commend to him that he add the first line of our motion as an additional first line of his motion when the time comes. And if he doesn't move the amendment, I will. So that when the time comes to consider his motion, I will move an amendment if he doesn't, so that it starts by reading, this House acknowledges the excellent work that the employees of Master Services Gibraltar Limited have done and do in discharging their obligations to keep Gibraltar clean. Because what these men and women do not deserve is that there should even be read in this House a motion which doesn't have that recognition in it. And for all of those reasons, Mr. Speaker, the House will not be supporting, the government will not be supporting the amendments put in this House by the Honourable Member.
Does any other Honourable Member wish to speak on the amendment? All right. Then I call upon the mover to reply.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I'd like to say I will certainly consider the Chief Minister's suggestion for adding the first paragraph of the government's motion as it stands at the moment to my motion, if that makes him feel better. But the reality is that he has taken the motion out of context. The government has taken the motion out of context in order to try and grandstand and suggest that those on this side of the House, certainly those of the GSD, are not supportive of the workers of master services, or even acknowledging the excellent work they do, and has been cited in my own speech. That could not be further from the truth. Indeed, I know neither the Minister nor the Chief Minister, when he stood up, and I certainly hope it'll come later on in their further interventions, have provided any of the assurances, reference things like pensions or breaking up the contract, that I sought in my own speech, which I think are very important and should be established today in this House.
So, Mr. Speaker, on the point of clarification, Mr. Speaker, I said specifically, I mean, the Honourable Gentleman is now replying to my lack of reply to an aspect of what he said in respect of the main motion. I said I was concentrating only on the words of his amendment. I will deal with those issues in the context of my reply on the motion, and I think it's very unfair that the Honourable Gentleman should say I haven't given assurances. I've said specifically that I'm dealing only with the wording of the amendment.
Which is why I said, Mr. Speaker, that I hope that is forthcoming in the interventions, because I've not heard such so far. The Chief Minister accuses me of being opportunistic with my motion. Again, that's just laughable, because there is an issue in Gibraltar. There are people commenting, there are people concerned about an issue, and we bring it to this House. That is not being opportunistic. That is doing the job that we are paid to do. It's very simple in that respect. We're not, you know. If you use that argument, then on every occasion that the opposition say anything that has been brought to them by a member of the public, they are being opportunistic. That's not opportunism. That is doing the job that we on this side of the House have been elected to do. And it's as simple as that. So why the Chief Minister should accuse us of, or me in particular, of opportunism in this respect, I really cannot understand. What we are doing is listening to the people. Again, I sense that the Minister was living in this blame culture and can't get away from it. He says, at questions, we blame the ministers. No, I do not blame the ministers for anything. That's not what it's about. What I do is I hold the ministers to account, because ministers are accountable for what goes on within their portfolios. They are the executive, the buck stops there, and they are accountable. And where they are failing, they need to be held to account. That is not the same as blame. It operates on a completely different level. And it really is high time that the government understood the nuance of that, because it is clearly it's not a modern way of thinking. It's just the way people think these days, as opposed to the way they were thinking perhaps in the 1970s, where somebody had to be to blame for everything. We're not blaming people, we are holding ministers to account, and we're certainly not blaming anyone, for the specific condition of our streets as they are today. We all acknowledge it isn't good enough. We all acknowledge something needs to be done to improve the situation, and that is enough. And achieving an improvement is enough. No one's to blame here. In this case, the ministers aren't to blame, the company isn't to blame, and the workers are most certainly not to blame. They do their job. They do the job they're paid to do. They do the job they paid to do very well. It's a tough job, and I think everyone in this House agrees with that. I'm disappointed that the motion, the amendment to the motion, will not be supported by the government, but I'm not surprised. But I will certainly consider the Chief Minister's original suggestion of adding a line in order to make absolutely clear that my own private member's motion is not directed at blaming anybody for the situation, as will become clear when I speak on that motion, which will be purely about the actual conditions of our streets. It'll analyse the condition in terms of the cleanliness and other factors, and I very much look forward to having that debate, hopefully later today.
I now put the question in the terms of the amendment moved by the Honourable Trevor Hammond. Those in favour? Those against? Can I ask how the honourable independent members are voting? Abstention?
Against.
Against. So there are 5 votes in favour, there is 1 abstention, there are 2 members absent. 2, 3, 4, 8, 9 against. The amendment is defeated, so we are still dealing with the original motion, and only the Honourable Trevor Hammond has spoken on that, so anybody else can now speak on the motion moved by the Honourable Dr. Cortes. The Honourable Elliot Phillips.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. I just want to speak to the part of the motion that considers the issue of unsatisfactory state of cleanliness and raise an issue that hasn't been raised in the Honourable Member, the Minister for the Environment, in relation to cleanliness, and that is, of course, the wider participation by the community and the civic participation in cleanliness. Now, clearly, at the present moment in time, master services have a job to do, and in the future, some other company may have a job to do. But without the participation of every single member of our community to keep our streets clean, they'll have to do a lot more work than they're doing now. This is a civic responsibility to keep our streets clean. And in fact, one of the questions that I asked the Honourable Member opposite in September of this year was how many fines had been imposed on those that were littering our streets, and also how many people have been prosecuted and how many fines had actually been paid. And the answer very simply was this. In 13 months since August last year, only 70 fines had been imposed, only 37 of those fines had been paid, and only 27 people had been prosecuted for littering our streets. That is, in fact, shameful. What we should be doing is a question of enforcement. These gentlemen and these ladies that clean our streets and keep our streets clean and not smelly, as the Honourable Member next to me said, deserve to have the reinforcement of the law to protect our streets and make sure that people are punished for littering our streets. And what we need is a more robust enforcement policy, and that needs to stem and lead from the front by the government. And that's all I have to say about that. But ultimately, it's about enforcement and the question of public participation, civic responsibility, and pride in our community, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Lawrence Llamas.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to address the House in relation to this motion with mixed feelings. As the Chair will have gathered from the contribution by honourable members, this motion comes to this House, chronologically at least, in the wake of a campaign that I designed to raise awareness of a very serious concerns I harboured about the disappointing state of cleanliness of our cherished homeland. I had received many complaints and seen countless more on social media about this, and it was gratifying, Mr. Speaker, to observe how, very quickly following the launch of the campaign under the slogan of Aquí no se limpia, we don't clean here, I began to receive news of, anecdotally of course, the improvements in cleaning in certain parts of the city. I am therefore, Mr. Speaker, thrilled to have played my part in raising awareness in the way the campaign did, and that today, after a good few weeks, we are now debating this very important issue here in this chamber. A moment ago, however, I alluded to the fact that I was making this contribution with mixed feelings. And those mixed feelings, Mr. Speaker, are for 2 reasons. Firstly, whatever has been done is simply not enough. But secondly, and more importantly, it is apparent to me, as it would be for anyone who has followed this matter online or in the press, that the government has sought to offload responsibility again to the GST administration, which left office in December 2011, and that the matter therefore comes before us in debate, with the inevitable partisan politicization of the issue and the consequent lack of progress I worry that it might bring. The Minister for the Environment has been quick to lay blame at the feet of the contractor responsible for cleaning our streets and public areas. The government has complained that the contract awarded to Master Service, allegedly in a manner which they say was not proper, was agreed in such terms that the government was not to blame, nor could they do anything about it. This has led the government to effectively telling us that when the contract is now tendered out, only then will they be free to restore Gibraltar to the level of cleanliness which we used to take for granted, a level of cleanliness which is sorely lacking today and which causes an untold harm in the context of the impression that we give, not to mention the health hazard it instinctively causes. I set out on this campaign to raise awareness intending only to motivate or compel the government with the force of public opinion to act. The issue with cleanliness boils down to this, Mr. Speaker, a very simple, accurate observation I have heard uttered by many and with which I wholly agree. Our roads and pavements used to get washed with water, Mr. Speaker, hosed down on a regular basis, and that it seems that just stopped with the advent of this new dawn. This was the basis of the concern, and this was a nub of the exercise to raise awareness. When the campaign began, I was surprised to be rebuked by a number of people who were telling me that I was playing right into the government's hands, that the government had always wanted to get rid of Master Service, and that raising awareness, as I did, would only give the government the leverage it wanted over the situation. Such rebuke, Mr. Speaker, always invoked the same response from me. Whatever the issue is, whatever the reason why we are living in such a filthy conditions, whatever the reason why our home is no longer maintained to the very high standard we had known for so long, all I want is for the government to act and for the problem to be dealt with. That is why I set out to raise awareness, and that is why I am here today, Mr. Speaker. A week after starting my campaign, the GST opposition filed a motion on the matter, one that was quickly followed by a counter-motion from the government. The filing of a motion in the House was something I thought about, but I thought it was likely to achieve little by way of an actual result. I thought would do little to tackle the dirt and rubbish on our streets, Mr. Speaker, serving only to kick off another Punch and Judy session in this chamber. And so it seems, this is what it has come to pass. I don't know the ins and outs of the contractual arrangements between the government and the supplier of these services in the community, and I don't care much for talk of revolutions at some point down the line when all we need to see is water being used to hose our pavements. It's not even so much the streets, as these tend to be kept quite well. It's the areas where we walk, in particular the areas in proximity of the port and the cruise liner terminal. I don't want to hear about a revolution, Mr. Speaker, because it sounds expensive. I don't want to hear about revolutions because it sounds like something was pretty short of the mark already, and they have been in government for the last 6 years. Mr. Speaker, if during that time the government was so concerned with the quality of the service Master Service was providing, was the government legally completely unable to do anything to remedy the situation? Was the government unable to do anything at all, or take any legal action either to enforce delivery of the contracted services or to seek damages? Was it powerless to do anything at all? There is also this, Mr. Speaker. The Master Service contract is one thing, but the contract for the Midtown car park is another altogether. The contract for the cleaning of that particular location was awarded by this government, as confirmed in answers to questions in this House. And that location, Mr. Speaker, is also falling woefully short of the mark in terms of its upkeep and cleanliness. It looks rather oppressively kept, and responsibility for that contract, Mr. Speaker, falls squarely on the shoulders of this administration. Whatever the answers to these questions, I remain committed to raising awareness of this issue because it seems, Mr. Speaker, that the campaign has at least part of the intended effect. The matter is being discussed and hopefully we will see progress sooner rather than later. There are two things that have also become clear to me since the start of the campaign. Yes, the people in our community are clearly and rightly incensed about the state of Gibraltar. But secondly, it is clear that we have to do our bit. However much government does to clean up our streets and our public areas, nothing will change if community at large does not keep Gibraltar looking like $1 million. This is another element of the campaign that I have been working on, which is so critical. Year after year, we see hundreds of people cleaning hotspots in the same locations, and yet day after day, we see people dumping their rubbish and unwanted furniture illegally, people throwing wrappers and other waste out of car windows, because they say, ya vendrá alguien para limpiarlo. It's just a question of zero civic pride, a lack of education, or the result of so many years of plenty for this community. Whatever the reasons, Mr. Speaker, shouldn't tackling these counterproductive attitudes be the subject of sustained and intense campaigning by the government and its agencies? I know awareness campaigns do happen every now and then, but the civic pride issue is one that deserves much attention. I do not wish to denigrate government, because we all see on TV and in our schools, for example, how it tries to get the message across. But it is a more fundamental malaise born of our affluence that we have yet not identified, much less begun to tackle. Finally, Mr. Speaker, no debate in this issue can be complete without reference being made to issues of enforcement. In the residential and commercial context, the rear of many restaurants are absolutely filthy and teeming with vermin and other pests. We need all those who do not maintain a clean property or recklessly sully our public streets to be met with a robust enforcement policy which will ensure that they think twice before they act in reckless ignorance of the harm they do to this community. I believe my approach and campaign has engaged with the community in a way which can only be productive and effective. More effective than simply bringing motions to this House and initiating a mudslinging debate as usually occurs in these situations, sidelining the subject of the motion and the fundamental and substantial matters relevant to it. The public are having their say, without a party political spat developing unnecessarily. I also hope that the employees of the current contractor can be, as far as possible, protected and guaranteed by the government. I am optimistic that despite the party political spat that has arisen as a result of it, that my campaign has caused the government to pause for thought. I hope that it has given the government new life in pursuit of these objectives, and that I am confident, one way or another, the community will not allow this issue ever again to be allowed to slip the public psyche for reasons other than the return of our beloved, clean, hygienic, attractive and beautiful Gibraltar. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Marlene Hassan now.
Mr. Speaker, the Chief Minister earlier said this is the heart of democracy. This is the heart of democracy, this House, and yet this morning the Master Services workers were not allowed in this chamber in order to hear what the heart of democracy had to say. I counted about 40 free chairs this morning, and yet people who are invested in this debate were not allowed in this chamber, and I would think it would be proper to have an answer as to why they were not allowed.
Allow me to intervene at this stage, lest it be thought mistakenly that we in Parliament had something to do with that prohibition. Neither the government, nor the opposition, nor I, as Speaker, had anything to do with whether those people were allowed into the chamber or not. As far as I am concerned as Speaker, members of the public, including the employees of Master Services, are very welcome here. And they are very welcome and will always be welcome, the only requirement being that they do not try to in any way make any demonstration or interruption of the proceedings of Parliament. They are very, very welcome here, and I am not aware as to the reason why that happened. The only situation that I can bring to the attention of members is this. The precincts of Parliament were, by ruling of the Honourable Major Robert Pelissa, deemed to include the pavement on the western side of Main Street. Therefore, any demonstration which is going to be held outside Parliament has to be on the other side on the eastern pavement of Main. That is the only matter that concerns me as Speaker, the ruling that Major Robert Pillay, and which I endorse, most certainly. So I make it clear that the pavement downstairs is regarded as being within the precincts of Parliament. But why members of the public have this morning not been allowed into, presumably by the Royal Gibraltar Police, I do not know. I have no idea. And I would say that it is a matter, if they so wish, for members of this Parliament to ask the appropriate authority as to why that has been the case. So I'd rather that we didn't take the matter any further. The point has been made by the Honourable Lady. I've explained what the position of this Parliament and I myself as Speaker is. Let us have nothing to say further here, and the matter, as I say, can be pursued outside this House.
I'm grateful, Mr. Speaker. I did not apportion blame to anybody. In fact, I raised this earlier with the Chief Minister, and he seemed unaware of this. So I was just raising the point because I find it wholly inappropriate that they were barred from this House. And I will be asking questions. I don't shy away from asking questions, as everybody knows. Mr. Speaker, I was pleased to note that the initial paragraph of this motion acknowledges the excellent work that the employees of Master Services Gibraltar Limited have done and do. I hereby take the opportunity to also commend their efforts and their constructive response to the recent controversy, as it seems to me that so far these workers have been treated simply like collateral damage. It is only fair that someone lays out their concerns on the map and that all parties accept their share of responsibility on the subpar state of our streets. The government shows good judgment when it states that little or no responsibility on the lack of cleanliness of our streets and neighbourhoods can be attributed to the workers of Master Service. Because in my view, Mr. Speaker, given the dramatic decrease in manpower, as we say in Gibraltar, demasiado están haciendo. It's a shame, however, that the government have decided to hide behind yet another dig at the GST administration for having awarded this contract to Master Service with no tender process. Is the government prepared to take any responsibility for the current state of affairs? Because, Mr. Speaker, a few smelly issues arise from this controversy. Firstly, for how long is government going to look to the past to justify their questionable U-turns? Mr. Speaker, this is getting a little tedious now after 6 years in office. And furthermore, Mr. Speaker, how can this government have the audacity to highlight a contract awarded by the GST administration with no competitive tender when what it is doing now, Mr. Speaker, is pulling the plug on an operation with 100+ employees which worked, Mr. Speaker, because say all you want about the GST's time in office, but Gibraltar's streets and neighbourhoods were squeaky clean, and that was something we could all be proud of. So in those circumstances, it's a bit like that old saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So what do we effectively have today, Mr. Speaker? A dirty, grimy Gibraltar, which today has no idea about what the future holds for its streets and the employees who clean them. Because, Mr. Speaker, there is a lot of uncertainty, an uncertainty which began when the new contract was announced and has definitely not been of the workers' making. The workers have continued to work to the best of their ability despite all this uncertainty and despite having been treated like pawns in this situation. In my view, this process, which they have found themselves in, should at least lead to a review of their working conditions. Also, when the government talks about stability, what do they mean exactly? Perhaps the government means stability in terms of longevity of the workers' contracts. But what is going to happen with regards to their terms and conditions? Does government have anything more than what has already been generically said to better reassure this workforce after almost a year of insecurity? For example, Mr. Speaker, the conditions at the moment for the government refuse collectors are much better than those of the Master Service employees. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, according to the Employment Act, the workers' pension entitlement is not overly protected. So I was pleased to hear Minister Cortes's assurances today that the government will ensure that their pension rights on a transfer of undertakings will be protected to a higher standard than is required by the law, and that this socialist government is going to protect the worker by increasing his or her rights in a dignified manner, given they now have the opportunity to do so. But nothing is yet totally clear, Mr. Speaker. And when government talk about the new contract designed to transparently ensure that Gibraltar is provided with better value for money for the taxpayer, will government be willing to make the new contract subject to public scrutiny in the name of this transparency they talk about? Because, Mr. Speaker, that would certainly be a departure from the past and very recent bad practices, and would finally show some real commitment to more accountability in line with the government's manifested aims in this regard. And in terms of budget, Mr. Speaker, where little has been said in the government motion, both government and the Master Service Directors have indeed confirmed that the Master Service budget did not increase in the last 2 years, something which has naturally had an effect on output and productivity. And this is where my smelly comment came from a year ago. Smelly streets and services were only a domino effect of this tightening of budget. Government has reflected on this by saying the workforce had nothing to do with the dirty state our streets are in. However, they have failed to mention that, contract or no contract, the budget is effectively decreasing in relation to inflation and expansion. Where is the ownership by government for this colossal lack of judgment? Or was it part of the plan to dump a GST undertaking literally in the trash? Mr. Speaker, I am afraid this motion does not deal with the key issues, which to me are, in more certain and specific terms, reassuring the workers on future terms and conditions, reassuring the electorate that the new contract will be awarded based on principles of transparency and efficiency, and reassuring the citizen that Gibraltar will be clean and that there is a plan amid all this uncertainty to make it clean. There is also a clear avoidance of responsibility on the part of government for the underfunding and neglect of this service under the current administration. So based on these facts, I will be voting against the motion.
Before we move on, I have been informed by a member of my staff that this morning the duty officer, police duty officer, informed him, the member of my staff, that an agreement had been reached by the police, apparently, and the General Secretary of the union representing Master Services, that only she and two members representing the staff would be present here. Be that as it may, I am glad to see that, in fact, this afternoon we have not only the General Secretary here with us, but what I would term is a significant representation of the members of Master Services. And I repeat that they are very welcome here. The Honourable Roy Clinton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this topic in respect of Master Services and the putting out to tender the contract is something that has been going on since February 2017 at least, if not before. And the GGCA, certainly in February 2017, were already expressing concerns about the anxiety this is causing their members and the uncertainty. And yet, Mr. Speaker, here we are 8 months later in October, and the minister's saying to the employees of Master Services, we will be putting out the tender at the earliest opportunity, possibly imminently. Could that mean shortly? And we all know what shortly means in this House. So, Mr. Speaker, in terms of their concern for the employees of Master Services, they have had 8 months to address those concerns, and yet here we are today. I fear, Mr. Speaker, that this motion is nothing more than a fig leaf to cover their inaction over the last 8 months. And Mr. Speaker, in their motion, they're very quick to blame others, But I see no solutions in this motion. They say they have complained to the directors of Master Services. Well, what were the complaints? I'm sure the House would be interested to know. And even more interesting would be, what was the response of the directors of the company? Could it be they said, well, look, we would love to do more, but you've cut our budget, or we haven't got the budgets anymore. We can't do this because we need more money, or whatever the reason is. And it's certainly not the fault of the workforce, because at the end of the day, they do their jobs as they're asked to do by a company, but the company can only do as much as it has the resources to do. Now, if what the government is saying is, well, the company somehow has been negligent in provision of this service, they didn't know what they were doing, but strange, they seem to have known what they were doing for the last 10 years. And it's only recently that suddenly it's become a huge issue. And so, Mr. Speaker, I would be very interested to hear what solutions it is that the Minister is going to propose, not just for the employees, but for Gibraltar as a whole. We hear there's going to be some magnificent new contract, but I really would like to know the detail, a little bit more detail perhaps, as to what is it that's going to change this magnificent new contract. Is it they're going to double the budget, or is it that there's going to be some new technology we don't know about? Either way, the employees would like to know, as would this side of the House. And so, Mr. Speaker, I find it unforgivable that it is 8 months that has gone past, and we've had no tender gone out to resolve the problems for the employees, the company, and indeed this community. And Mr. Speaker, when we talk about tender, I sincerely hope that when the tender does go out, albeit in the European Journal, that it doesn't appear in a local paper for one day, 10 days before Christmas, expecting a full proposal to be in just before the holidays. Because that, Mr. Speaker, is hardly what I would call fair. And in that tender, I would expect to see full details as to what it is that the government proposes. And I sincerely hope that we will see a significant difference in this tender to what it is the Master Services already provides. I have heard no new ideas from the government as to what it is they will do to do things differently, and I've heard nothing that the government has said so far that provides any comfort to the people of Gibraltar as to how the services in respect of cleanliness will improve. And of course, Mr. Speaker, the employees are entirely blameless in this. I think we can agree on this in this House. However, the government cannot avoid its responsibility for the delivery of services. And in doing so, Mr. Speaker, they need to provide solutions. And today we have heard no solutions. I would invite the Minister to provide this House with solutions. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Contributor to this debate? The Honourable the Chief Minister.
Having dealt with the issue of the proposed amendments, I'm now going to deal with the substance of the things that Mr. Hammond said in the context of his speech. Mr. Speaker, when the Honourable Minister rose to introduce his motion, he talked about the reality of what everyday life on our streets is, whether it's a day of rain, whether it's a summer's day, a sticky Levanter day, a national day. Each of those circumstances produces a different sort of environment that needs to be dealt with, and it's very ably dealt with by the men and women who work at Master Services. And that is, Mr. Speaker, the sort of complexity that people might not bother to seek to understand when they are simply on social media trying to make a point about an area looking better or less smart. It's surprising, Mr. Speaker, that those of us who are elected to this House think that we need to run campaigns on social media, and that bringing motions to this House is not worth anything, as the Honourable Mr. Yamas has suggested, just that we will have a political debate on it. Well, I commend to Mr. Yamas that he should resign his seat, he should make himself a social media activist, and allow those who are interested in coming to this House to make political arguments to do so. Because that is what this House is about. This is not about aquí no se limpia, this is about aquí se debate, Mr. Speaker. And some of what we have heard said in the context of the past 3/4 of an hour is really gobsmacking in the context of how people think that we're going to be able to conduct the political debate. I mean, Mr. Speaker, all the senses are engaged, but surely we're not going to spend time thinking about whether something is smelly or less smelly, Mr. Speaker. We're not going to spend time looking at, about our streets on the aquí no se limpia basis, aquí si se limpia basis. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, what we're not going to do, if we're not going to fall into the culture of blame, which the Honourable Mr. Hammond has invited us to do, although Mr. Clinton has quickly brought the GSD back to its roots and said that it's all the minister's fault, what we're not going to do is sit here and pretend that all of this debate and the improvement of the quality of cleaning in our streets when it comes is down to Lawrence Llamas and his little camera and his Aquí no se limpia campaign. Because, Mr. Speaker, even in the context of what he has said, with the contributions from the opposite side, we can demonstrate that the position is not as he suggested. Because Mr. Clinton has said, we've been having the debate about the tender since February 2017, and Aquí no se limpia was a short-run thing in late August, early September. And he admits that, Mr. Speaker, when Mr. Llamas says that shortly after he ran his campaign, the motions came in, namely for the September session of the House. So even when it comes to trying to take credit, the honourable gentleman cannot get the chronology right. But this is a place to debate how we get things right and how we improve upon things. And Facebook, Mr. Speaker, is the place where he can go and do that in debate with any other member of the community. And Twitter is a place where he can do it with any other member of the community. But in this place, it's about something else. We've already had Facebook and Twitter erupting in our budget debate. Let's not bring it further into the proceedings of this House, Mr. Speaker. It was not particularly edifying when it crept in then. Mr. Speaker, the government dearly values the work that is done by the men and women of Master Services. The Honourable Minister has said so. He said that he himself has swept the streets at Alameda Gardens. Well, Mr. Speaker, Joe Bossano became Chief Minister of Gibraltar, and gave us all a lesson this morning on international law and swept the streets of West Ham in London. On this side of the House, Mr. Speaker, we have family members who sweep the streets of Gibraltar like I do, Mr. Speaker, who have swept the streets of Gibraltar like I do, and we sincerely and deeply value what that work entails, Mr. Speaker, and that's why we won't denigrate it. In particular, Mr. Speaker, we won't denigrate it when, and this is a point I think on which the whole House agrees, when people in our community fail to understand their personal obligation to keep our streets clean, be that with their children and teaching their children not to drop litter and not to litter generally, be it themselves. I think it is disgraceful that a car with a Gibraltar number plate should be seen as a place from which people discard rubbish. That is absolutely disgraceful. It's the sort of thing that I associate with number plates of another nation, not the number plates of the cars licensed in Gibraltar. The fact that people think that they can fly tip, Mr. Speaker, which is also an issue that affects Master Services and the general refuse collection services of the government. And, Mr. Speaker, I think it is also important that we realize the fact that people don't clean up after their pets. Now, that is not going to be fixed with 2 dog parks. It's going to be fixed by people taking responsibility for their pets. And indeed, it's going to be fixed by people sometimes thinking that they might not be able to own a pet if they have not got the facilities to ensure that they can clean up after them. And I commend the Honourable Member for the Environment for the DNA testing facility that is going to, I think, make a difference in that respect, although it is not going to happen overnight, Mr. Speaker. But when people take their dogs out and allow them to urinate in particular and defecate on the streets, in some instances, people clean up after themselves. In most instances, even now, Mr. Speaker, they do not. And look, it's very easy to see where somebody has made a removal and the efforts have not been as successful as they could be, but at least the person has tried to remove the defecation. But the animals still urinate, Mr. Speaker, and people don't take the vinegar and water required to remove that. And that is endemic, Mr. Speaker. Part of the problem on our streets is the urination of animals owned animals and not stray animals. And that is not something that the men and women of Master Services deserve to be blamed for. And it's not something that happens under the GSLP anymore, any less than it happened under the GSD or indeed under any previous administration. It is something which requires civic pride. It is something which requires deep understanding of what we can and cannot do as a community and what you can and cannot do as a property owner. Now, Mr. Speaker, dealing generally with the issues, I think it is important that we understand that the number of fines there have been, the number of prosecutions there have been for littering, etc., is by the measure of the Honourable Mr. Phillips low. 70 fines and 27 prosecutions, he says, is woefully low. I don't know whether he said disgracefully low. In a year, yep, every year. Mr. Speaker, that's probably more than there ever has been in the history of Gibraltar in that period. Now he says that's not the point. Well, Mr. Speaker, look, as something, the point is now, Mr. Speaker, today he wants 1,000 fines for littering, Mr. Speaker. And then when we have them, Mr. Hammond will get up and say, Mr. Speaker, 1,000 fines multiplied by £100, they made £1 million because they're running out of money. Well, look, Mr. Speaker, I mean, the honourable members opposite have to know that they have to get beyond the joke that they are making of this place. Because it is absolutely right that the civic pride is linked, unfortunately, to the enforcement aspect. Of course it is. And if he wants to see more fines and more prosecutions, well, look, Mr. Speaker, fair enough. But can he at least acknowledge that there are more now than there ever have been, and that this is progress? And if it is progress, Mr. Speaker, can he commend the government for that progress, even if there has to be more progress in his view? But look, Mr. Speaker, I'll say it to the Honourable Lady, I'll say it to him, and I'll say it to Mr. Llamas. This idea that we are not allowed to put the clock at zero on the 9th of December 2011 when it's convenient to them. When it's convenient to them, we're building on the legacy of the GSD. But otherwise, Mr. Speaker, everything has to be judged as it is under us without us looking back. Look, Mr. Speaker, don't they know that famous Churchill phrase, it's only by looking far into the past that you will see further into the future. And that affects everything that we're doing in relation to this matter. This is not Picaldo trying to take it out on the GSD. This is Churchill, somebody who we all regard as demonstrating a deep understanding of the political makeup of our Western civilization. We have to look back, not to make the same mistakes when we go forward. And the mistake, Mr. Speaker, is to give a contract to your mates, a large contract, a multi-million-pound contract to your mates, Mr. Speaker. I haven't mentioned his mates, Mr. Speaker, so I don't see what the objection is. He might like to tell us what it is.
It's the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, absolutely. There is. Yes. And you'll be able to substantiate that. Absolutely.
Mr. Speaker, that's what my speech is about. It is improper. It is improper that, contrary to European rules, and contrary even to national rules which transpose European rules, the GSD gave the contract for the cleaning of Gibraltar to their mates. I've said it 100 times. I don't know why it is that he hasn't objected the first time I've said it. Without a tender. So therefore, Mr. Speaker, to now be told that it is hoped that we will not do the same thing when what we have announced is the opposite. What we have announced is that we're doing a European tender for this project because the amounts involved are so high that they should never have been subject to being handed to one entity, a group of individuals or otherwise. We're going to a European tender, to the European Journal. It's a good thing we're leaving the European Union, Mr. Speaker, because if Mr. Clinton had to continue to grapple with the European rules, he'd realize that there are specific periods of requirement of advertising which you cannot get out of when you do a European tender, Mr. Speaker. So there's no question of something being advertised on one day for another in a local newspaper or otherwise. It has to be advertised in the European Journal for a specific period of time, Mr. Speaker. And that is what's going to happen here. And then, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady will not be able to say that we have been anything other than entirely transparent in the context of this tender, as we are in respect of all others. Because when we do not grant something by tender, we grant something directly to someone after a process of 3 quotes, which is a mechanism introduced by members opposite when matters do not have by law got to go to European tender. We don't willy-nilly hand out any contract, and I resent the suggestion that we ever have in any instance. And we have debated, Mr. Speaker, the instance of the MTV festival, which is the instance that she might be alluding to, which was an instance where it was absolutely right, and in the public interest of Gibraltar, that we leverage the possibility to advertise Gibraltar services around the world, as we did in respect of that particular contract, although I know that one of the people who appeared in the video with her was particularly against that. Well, Mr. Speaker, it was the right decision, and it couldn't have been more transparent. It couldn't have been more transparent. The whole world has seen what we've done in Gibraltar with MTV on MTV, Mr. Speaker, and that was the whole point. Everything we are doing is subjected to absolute and utter transparency, Mr. Speaker. And if she thinks it's not the case, instead of attacking us with innuendo, she should attack us with facts. She should tell us which other contracts she said haven't been granted with full transparency, and then we'll deal with those issues. Because that is the way that we must deal with things, Mr. Speaker, not on the basis of a rumorology, which is fast becoming her style. And that's not fair, Mr. Speaker. It's not fair, in particular, on the good men and women who are at the sharp end of the work that is done by Master Services under all parts of the contract granted in 1999, the contract renewed in 2004, and the contract then renewed again by the GSD in 2007, Mr. Speaker. For 10 years, by the way, I should say. Mr. Speaker, I was frankly this morning very disappointed to see that the workforce of Master Service had been denied access to the Parliament, and I'm very grateful that you have clarified what the circumstances were. But when I walked downstairs, I was met by members of the GGCA committee and by members of the staff of Master Services who explained to me what had happened, and I put the position to them exactly as you have today, that as far as I'm concerned, any member of the public is able to enter this place, and they are subject only to the control of the Speaker in the context of public order in the gallery. And I'm very pleased, Mr. Speaker, that some of them are here this afternoon. This is an issue that directly concerns them, and that is why the government has moved the motion that defends the work that they have done. And I'm very pleased to see, Mr. Speaker, the new attempts at one-upmanship on the other side, where members opposite have tried to muscle in on the government's defense of the work of the men and women of Master Services, having shamefully actually taken the position that they took in the private members' motion that I've already alluded to, which does not mention the work of the men and women of Master Services. Mr. Speaker, the wider participation of the community is something which is essential and on which I agree with Mr. Phillips. We see every year how the Clean Up the World campaign, when undertaken in Gibraltar by volunteers, with the assistance in some instances of Master Services and materials provided by them, leads to the collection of the most impossibly huge amount of rubbish every year. And you wonder, how does this accumulate? How does this accumulate? Well, we cannot blame the tourist. We cannot say it is simply the tourist that is coming to Gibraltar and is discarding their rubbish because they don't care because it's not their home. It is absolutely true to say that there are Gibraltarians who are failing in their civic duty to this community to ensure that they do not litter. And beyond the men and women of Master Services, beyond the men and women of the Ministry for the Environment, what about the young children and the teams from around Gibraltar Civic Society who form part of the Clean Up Gibraltar campaign? Mr. Speaker, I formed part of those campaigns in the past, and I see children from our schools who have the civic pride to go out and give up a Saturday during their weekend to collect rubbish that should not be there in the first place. I see divers who get into the sea and pull out rubbish that's been put there. And I see people who go into very hairy circumstances on the upper rock and balance where I wouldn't be too keen to balance in order to collect rubbish to clean up Gibraltar. And you would have thought, Mr. Speaker, that there'd be less of this rubbish around and that every year there would be less because some of it looks like old rubbish. And you think, well, that's from a bygone era. We have more civic pride now. No, Mr. Speaker, every year there is the same quantity. That is absolutely not fair. It is absolutely the wrong thing to see happen in our community, and it adds to the work that has to be done by the men and women who are at the sharp end of this at Master Services, and it adds to what the government has to seek redress for in the context of the contract that will go out to tender. And that is what honourable members will see. The contract that goes out to tender now in the European Journal will be very detailed as to what it is that we are seeking to ensure is dealt with, and that is the big idea, Mr. Speaker, and that is what has taken time, because honourable members opposite seem to want to see things happen quickly, but they don't realize that in order to do things properly, it is sometimes important not to move with great haste, but to move with a little bit more care. And that is what we are going to achieve. And in the context of whether choosing to continue down that road or whether to go down the road of nationalization of the contract, I mean, I could not see a more populist move coming, Mr. Speaker. Frankly, for the Honourable Mr. Hammond to say in this House that we should consider nationalization, when what we favour actually is a tender, successful tender, which involves the men and women of Master Services in ownership of their own entity, is really the most populist measure I've seen deployed in this House. Now, it is impossible, Mr. Speaker, for the Honourable Mr. Hammond to reconcile the position that he has taken with the stated position of the opposition under both Mr. Hammond, under both Mr. Confused which one of them is vying for what position. They're all at it. Under Mr. Feetham, or now under Mr. Clinton, or I expect in the future under Mr. Sabaldi. Because one of the things that they've made the hallmark of their election campaigns and their position in this House is the growth of the public sector and the growth of recurrent expenditure. And yet now he's encouraging me, I guess because it's popular, to take on another 100 into the public sector. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for all of us that Mr. Feetham is no longer in a leadership role. Otherwise, the explosion that we would have seen would have been tremendous. I mean, maybe it would explain the burning that's going on, Mr. Speaker. Parece un bandolero. Mr. Speaker, it is just impossible to reconcile with the politics of the GSD of the past 5 years. Now, look, let us be honest and say, we in the GSD stand for whatever is popular at whatever moment in time we may be, depending on whatever audience happens to be in the room. And if that is the case, well, look, people will judge you on that basis. But let us not also pretend to be consistent. Let us not pretend to be consistent. Because what there is an encouragement by the honourable gentleman for the government to do the opposite of everything that they have been telling us to do for the past 5 years. Well, we have, in some instances, particularly in the health service, included more people in the complement. All we have faced is constant attack for having done so. So either, Mr. Speaker, they haven't just changed their policy on joint sovereignty and on Spain and on National Day, they've gone out to subscribe to the politics of the GSLP, or they are being wholly inconsistent. And, Mr. Speaker, this was a contract granted under their administration, and it was put at arm's length by their administration. I've said what I've said about the grant of it, but it existed as an arm's length contract. It was renewed. The 1999 contract expired in 2004. It was renewed on a yearly basis for 3 years until 2007. And then, Mr. Speaker, it was renewed for 10 years under the GSD. For 10 years as a contract at arm's length. Now, what's different now that they're in opposition and we're in government? Because the former leader of the opposition who's with us in this House was in that government which granted the extension for 10 years outside of European rules. Why were they not nationalizing then? I don't understand how, with a straight face, I guess a blameless straight face, he thinks he can make the argument now. Better, Mr. Speaker, better to advance the cause of the men, to favor the possibility, if they can do it, of them being part of the ownership of the entity that takes the contract in the future. Because that, Mr. Speaker, would be better than just a few taking a handsome 10% profit on top of the cost of the contract, which is what the cost-plus contract that the GSD gave is all about. Just so that Mr. Clinton understands this, Mr. Speaker, the contract they gave outside of the European tender rules is a contract where what the contractor spends, the government must add 10% to. This is not a way of controlling cost, Mr. Speaker. This is a way of encouraging more cost. And that's what's wrong with the contract. Cost plus. You, contractor, do the best you can to spend as much as you can, and we'll add 10% on top. And that doesn't go to the men, Mr. Speaker. And when you control the cost, I bet it's not the 10% that is controlled. I bet it's the men that suffer the loss of earnings. I bet it's the men that lose out on overtime. But the bonuses, those aren't the ones reduced, Mr. Speaker. The 10% cost carryover, that's not what is reduced, Mr. Speaker. It's the men and the women at the sharp end who suffer. That's what's wrong with this contract in particular. And if they were genuine on the other side, Mr. Speaker, about being concerned about recurrent expenditure, they would condemn every single one of the cost-plus contracts given by the GSD. That is an area where blame must attach. This is not, therefore, Mr. Speaker, about offloading responsibility to the GSD. It's about fixing the mistakes of the GSD, Mr. Speaker. But I do not recognize that Gibraltar is suffering filthy conditions. And I certainly do not recognize, Mr. Speaker, I do not recognize that Gibraltar was squeaky clean under the GSD. I mean, Mr. Speaker, how can you make that up? How can you even make that up, Mr. Speaker? Look, I lived at Calpe, Mr. Speaker, all of my life until I moved away. And Calpe was not squeaky clean. Look, it's not squeaky clean under the ACR, it wasn't squeaky clean under the GSLP, it wasn't squeaky clean under the GSD, and it's not squeaky clean today. I would love it to be squeaky clean, and every corner of Gibraltar. And that's what this tender is designed to try and do. But the idea that we create a halcyon past, a Potemkin village, which is what Gibraltar was under the GSD. Look it up, right? And we pretend that we've moved to that, to where we are today. I mean, come on, Mr. Speaker. Aquí no se miente, aquí no va a comentar. I mean, it's nonsense. And the suggestion somehow is that there is now a failure in the service, Mr. Speaker. Well, look, we don't recognize that at the sharp end of the service there's a failure. And that's why we brought this motion, to defend the people who are at the sharp end of the service, Mr. Speaker. And look, at Midtown, which is an area which is not cleaned by master services, it is true that there is a want of cleanliness on some occasions. But this is a car park cleaned every day, with exhaust fumes from diesel engines in there. We all hope one day there will be no exhaust fumes from diesel engines. It'll be electric, and then we won't have those issues. Next to the biggest building site in town. Now, if you judge cleanliness by what happens when there's building going on, then all of us have lived in places which are filthy, because we've always, all of us, I'm sure, had works done either in a kitchen or in a bathroom, and however much we try at home when there are works going on, it is impossible to keep things clean. You'll know that you clean, and a few hours later, even when there isn't work going on because the dust is settling, it becomes, again, unattractive, and we have to clean again. That's normal, Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, because the government does not have a magic wand to control dust from a building site. And we have the biggest building site in Gibraltar today, which is the Midtown development, next to the Midtown car park. So I would say, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman should judge the cleanliness of the Midtown car park once the biggest building site in town has moved on in that respect. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady, when she raised the issue of the ability of members of Master Service to come into the House, wanted to say that they would always be welcome here, and she was absolutely right to say that. you followed up, and I associate myself with that. But look, the men and women of Master Services are not just welcome in this place, they're welcome in my office, where they have been on a number of occasions and received the reassurances that honourable members here are trying to seek and extract on their behalf. They've had those reassurances in meetings with me about what it is that the government intends to do. They've had reassurances about this being one contract. They've had reassurances about the protection and improvement of the terms and conditions of employment. Indeed, they have had reassurances even beyond that, because the government wants to see the men and women of what is presently the Master Services crew succeed in the future. Mr. Speaker, this is therefore not about a dig at the GSD or about U-turns. What U-turns? We're not pulling the plug on an operation that works, Mr. Speaker. We are ensuring that we pull the plug on an operation that was created improperly. And we're going to ensure that the contract is now granted properly and in keeping with the proper rules. I don't think it's fair to say that Gibraltar is dirty and grimy, although, Mr. Speaker, I think Gibraltar must be cleaner in the future. But words like that create the image of a Gibraltar that I do not recognize and that honourable members should not be seeking to propagate. Because, you see, we fall into the trap sometimes of politics of talking everything down simply because we're not in government. That is bad for this community, Mr. Speaker. It is bad for the future of Gibraltar, and it is not, in my view, not fair politics. So stability is what will come from properly tendering this contract and properly ensuring the future of those who work in this company for the future. Subject, of course, as I said to her, to the full glare of public scrutiny in a European tender. But again, this is not about underfunding. Where is the underfunding? Where is the underfunding? Simply because we haven't increased the amounts that we spent in respect of the budgets? Or is it that honourable members don't see the increases based on inflation? Is it that honourable members don't see the increases in other departments, like health, based on inflation? Or is it that honourable members are suggesting, because it's convenient to them today, and they're not bringing the arguments that they bring during the budget debate, that we should somehow have increased the recurrent expenditure of Gibraltar, the opposite of what they have been saying to us that we should do? So this is not about fig leaves, Mr. Speaker, although I think the GSD is left not even with a fig leaf to defend the way it granted this contract in the mid-90s and then in 2007. Not even a fig leaf of protection for the way that they acted. What there is, Mr. Speaker, is now a plan to ensure the tendering of this contract for wider services as one contract, and to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that that provides the security that the men and women of Master Services deserve. Has it taken some time? Yes, it has taken some time, Mr. Speaker. It was brought to our attention in February that the contract was going to come to a conclusion, and we have designed the new tender requirements. This is not easy, Mr. Speaker. It is not easy, in particular, when the procurement department is digitizing the service that it's going to provide. It's not easy when ministers have to ensure that we act in keeping with European rules. And it's not easy, Mr. Speaker, if we want to act to protect the interests of the workers, because we need to ensure that the way that the tender is constructed, that is provided for. So, Mr. Speaker, I think that this is a new big idea. This is the new way of ensuring that Gibraltar's streets are cleaner than they have been in the past, by giving the tools to the people who we ask to be on the ground at the sharp end doing that work in the context of the way that we tender for the contract, and in the context of the way that the public's money is used in that tender, so that we're not doing cost plus, and that additional amount is a bonus for those who are not getting their hands dirty, getting wet on a rainy day, and ensuring that they do their best and give their hardest work to keep Gibraltar clean. But to the people who sit around the boardroom tables, hatching how, or reminding themselves of how they managed to secure this contract in the first place, that's what we're not going to do. We stand with them, Mr. Speaker, not with those who took the contract contrary to European rules.
Any other contribution before I call upon the mover to reply? The Honourable John Cortes.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's been an interesting day, and certainly and there's a lot more to come, Mr. Speaker. And certainly this debate has been an interesting one. I think I can say I've been disappointed by a lot of the comments coming from the opposition benches, if only that many of them were repetitive. I suppose the fact that we de facto now have 3 different points of view in the opposition is one that is reflected today and will be reflected in days to come. Speaker, as the Chief Minister has said, a tender of this nature is a long and complex process. And I am proud to say that there has been a great deal of consultation with stakeholders, and as well as commitment to the union and the workforce that they will be totally protected. And they well know that my office and that of the Chief Minister have been open and continue to be open to discuss any uncertainties that they may have until this is finally concluded. Mr. Speaker, we have gone over and over the schedules. We've been responding to the professionals, and we have involved the Environmental Safety Group, who are the people who for many years, as the Chief Minister has said, have been spearheading the Clean Up the World in Gibraltar and doing excellent work. And they have been involved in assisting us in drawing up the schedules, because we want to draw on the experience that they have, and this has taken time. Mr. Speaker, this debate cannot be a review of the whole waste strategy of the government. That is something that we could debate another day, and that is something that does turn up in our budget speeches. But I must say that any suggestion that the question of cleanliness has somehow slipped attention until the Honourable Mr. Llamas raised it on Facebook just does not hold any water. This is something that my department has been working on very hard over the past years. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Mr. Phillips mentioned fines, and the Chief Minister answered that point in the way that I'm just going to repeat. How many fines had been issued in a similar period any time in the history of our community? Mr. Speaker, it was this government that introduced litter tickets. It was this government that introduced litter wardens. It is this government that reactivated the litter committee, that meets regularly and discusses these things time and time again. Mr. Speaker, there has been a lot of work done in this field, and the fact that we are now able to issue these tickets and that we have increased the number, certainly not enough. And as I always say, if anybody ever asks me, is enough being done on any environmental topic, my answer will always be no, because I will always aspire to more. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Llamas does not have the exclusive on seeing the state of the road, of our streets. And it's very easy, Mr. Speaker, to post on Facebook and to do videos, but that is very comfortable when you don't have to do anything other than that. We have already taken up the question of our streets, and people do have short memories. Let me just explain, for example, one of the issues that I tackled early on in 2012. And this was a question of flushing the streets. Mr. Speaker, people seem to think that the streets were being flushed during the so-called squeaky clean days of the GST, when they weren't. I remember attending the first meeting of the committee that I set up and saying, well, what frequency are we flushing streets? Well, really, we can't flush any streets because people won't remove the cars, and then there's no point, and we can't really do deep cleans in this estate or that estate. And I said, well, I got a street cleaning committee together. And when I raised it again, well, people don't remove the cars. Well, let us now enforce the removal of cars. Well, but there haven't been any signs in the estates for years, and therefore we cannot remove the cars because the estates, that the signs have fallen off, they haven't been replaced. So it was our initiative that we reintroduced that. Nobody had even bothered to replace the signs in the estates so that they couldn't even clean the cars so they could flush. So this thing about squeaky cleanliness in GST days is simply not true. But in any case, when we started cleaning and heeding the signs that we eventually replaced, we were down to contractual obligations. And as I explained before, the contract was simply not good enough. Mr. Speaker, the tender will now be published in the next possible opportunity in the European Journal. It's not putting it off sine die. It is in the next possible opportunity. It has to be submitted and published in the journal. And then the detail in its schedules and so on will, of course, become public knowledge. And that has been the work of the last few years, in which we have realized the shortcomings of what was being done. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Hammond tried to jump on a bandwagon. And it seems that every member of the opposition now thinks that the workforce of master service is the best thing since sliced bread. Well, hang on, we were the ones who said it first. Mr. Hammond had the opportunity to include this in his motion, and he did not. Now he's considering the Chief Minister's suggestion that he should. It's almost like he said, well, oops, the minister is right. I've put my foot in it. I'd better look like, I really do feel that the workforce is absolutely wonderful, and I'd better put it in my speech. And now the Chief Minister has given me the opportunity, to exonerate myself and perhaps accept an amendment. Well, Mr. Speaker, he didn't put it in. So either he doesn't really mean that he thinks so highly about these men and women, or it didn't even occur to him that he should. And that's almost as bad, if it didn't even occur to him that he should mention the workforce, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the workforce will be protected, and they know they will be protected. And government will ensure that the conditions are guaranteed, and that the welfare is guaranteed, and that they have security in the present and in the future. And this has been very clear throughout in all my dealings with them. So, Mr. Speaker, I look forward to an improved contract for the benefit of Gibraltar, with guarantees for the workforce, and that next summer, those people who like to post on Facebook will have something else to write about. I commend this motion to the House.
I now put the question in the terms of the motion moved by the Honourable Dr. John Cortes. Those in favour? Aye. Those against? Nay. I didn't hear. Those against? Nay. 1, 2. I think 2. Shall we call a division and make
So
sure?
we have a division.
Let's have a division.
Mr. Speaker, I didn't have the speaker on, but I was suggesting politely that we have a division, precisely because I foresaw a bit of confusion, more so for the benefit of the clerk. I think she's done wonderful today for being her first session, so it's up to us to make life easier for her.
The Honourable P.J. Balvan.
Aye.
The Honourable J.J. Bossano.
Yes.
The Honourable R.M. Clinton.
Yes.
The Honourable J.E. Cortes.
Yes.
The Honourable D.A. Feetham.
Aye.
The Honourable T.N. Hammond.
Yes.
The Honourable M.D. Hassan Naon.
No.
The Honourable A.J. Isola.
Aye.
The Honourable G.H. Likudi.
Aye.
The Honourable S.E. Linares.
Aye.
The Honourable L.F. Llamas.
No.
The Honourable E.J. Phillips.
Yes.
The Honourable F.R. Picardo.
Aye.
The Honourable E.J. Reyes.
Aye.
The Honourable S.J. Sacramento.
Yes.
There are 2 members absent. 2 have voted against the motion, and 13 have voted in favour. The motion is carried.